Hello, everyone. Juxtaposition here. I wanted to go through some San Francisco CIA factoids that have never been reported in the media and will never be reported in the mainstream poppycock media. But they're historic and I think they're relevant. And it goes to this question of does correlation equal causation? And typically, my experience is well, yeah, it does. Correlation and causation are almost synonymous when you're dealing with black ops, concealed money laundering, funded, sponsored, felonious crimes committed by CIA and the bank who enables those criminal acts. So, this is going to involve activities going on in San Francisco when Paul Pelosi had moved back home to San Francisco from New York City, where he'd started his finance career. So Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi Jr., who is a few months old, moved to Presidio Heights, next door to the Presidio Army Base, and I mean right next door. And we had Abigail Folger's mother, Enos Mejia, living on Broadway, in close proximity to 2222 Broadway, where the convent of the Sacred Heart Elementary School is. And that's in close proximity to this alleged Pelosi hammer attack, which is at 2640 Broadway, where Paul Pelosi, I don't really think he lives there. I think he lives on Pacific Avenue, about 5 blocks to the east, up a block, uphill, with a view of Belvedere and the Golden Gate Bridge. That's where I think he lives. But anyway, because this was a CIA planned, orchestrated attack with surveillance cameras, which they won't show you the video from, but we know it's taped, it's recorded. It's like the John Kennedy assassination. You know that was filmed, right? And I don't think that Abraham Zapruder was the only CIA cameraman. I think there were other people filming that, but you know, they're not going to show you what happened, because it's completely different than how it's been portrayed. Even in the Oliver Stone JFK film, Oliver Stone's name is Silverstein. It's Silverstein. His father is Louis Silverstein. So somehow we went from Silverstein to Stone. Also had another Jewish fellow from the Bronx, New York, who came out to Dallas to do a series of films, quasi-documentary, social engineering films. Mark Lane. Mark Lane interviewed numerous witnesses, some of which were called by the Warren Commission, some were not. Mark Lane, who that's not his real name. His name is Levin, because he's a Jewish fellow from the Bronx. Mark Levin. And he's going to come into the story I'm going to tell you in San Francisco, even though you wouldn't think that Mark Levin would have anything to do with San Francisco. But we have Diane Feinstein, who's Jewish, and her 3 husbands who are Jewish. And we have Bill Graham, whose real name is Wolf Krajonka, from New York City, who's Jewish. And he sets up shop in San Francisco with no job, right? Bill Graham has no job. He's going to promote free concerts. 1965, comes out here. Well, how's he going to live? Who's going to provide provisional housing? Who's going to buy his groceries? Well, Abigail Folger's mother's going to take care of that, because she's got an office in Haight, Ashbury. She goes to Mass at St. Ignatius Parish, like 3 blocks to the west. So she's in that neighborhood all the time. She works in the neighborhood. She works with Timothy Leary. She works with Ken Kesey. She works with Hunter S. Thompson. She works with Louis Jolion West, who's the only medical doctor in that neighborhood, but he's a psychiatrist. He's an MK Ultra CIA psychiatrist. And she's working with David Smith, who's injecting mice with amphetamines and LSD. And she's working with a fake parole officer for the federal government who goes by the name of Roger Smith. A lot of Smiths, right? David Smith, Roger Smith. I think they do that on purpose, like a lot of Pauls. Paul Tate, Paul James Tate, Colonel in Army Intelligence, Sharon Tate's father, Paul Tate, Paul Pelosi Sr., Paul Pelosi Jr., Paul Stein, yellow cab taxi driver, gets shot in the head with a 9mm. Paul Stein is murdered in Paul Pelosi's neighborhood, which is also Paul Tate's neighborhood, Sharon Stone's father's neighborhood, Paul Pelosi's neighborhood. Nancy Pelosi's neighborhood, Paul Stein Jr.'s neighborhood. Anyway, that was on October 11th, 1969. And I believe that the Pelosi family was well ensconced in Presidio Heights at that time. Presidio Heights is different than Pacific Heights, where I believe they may have one or two or three homes in Pacific Heights, either on Broadway or on Pacific Avenue, which have views of the Golden Gate Bridge. Where the hammer attack happened, you can't get a good view from that property. So I'm going to call that a clandestine service theatrical events home, not the real home, the fake home, to fake you out. So what I wanted to tell you is that August 9th, 1969 was when Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger were bayoneted brutally by the M7 bayonet, which would have been attached. It has an attachment here. It has an easy attachment. I don't know if you can see this, but it attaches on and off to a rifle. And the caliber of that rifle would be .22 caliber. M16 rifle, I believe, can handle the .22 caliber long nose cartridges, or with some modifications. Anyway, so Abigail Folger was bayoneted 28 times in a 360-degree radial pattern outside on the lawn, which meant that she was fleeing the house where she didn't live. She did not live there. She was sleeping overnight there. She was in her nightgown. She had a 10 a.m. flight to San Francisco Saturday morning, and I understand why she slept overnight at the murder scene. That was how they lured her there. She was seeing a psychologist 5 days a week in Beverly Hills, Dr. Marvin Flicker, and his office is off Rodeo Drive. It's literally, a mile from the murder scene. It's right down the hill. It's close proximity to Rodeo Drive and Sunset Boulevard. Is Dr. Flicker's home actually is in his home. It's in his residence. It's next door to the Los Angeles Country Club golf course, which is a block or two from Rodeo Drive. Okay, it's near the Playboy Mansion. It's kind of sort of over by Holmby Hills. It's not technically Holmby Hills. It's called Beverly Hills. It's next door to Holmby Hills. And Hugh Hefner was not yet residing in Holmby Hills on August 9th, 1969. It's important for me to get these dates correct, people. The Playboy Mansion in Holmby Hills was established, I believe, in 1974. And so that's well after the Sharon Tate murder, which happened in 1969. But you should know that Walt Disney, who had passed away, he died in 1966. He lived at 354 Carrollwood Drive, North Carrollwood Drive, which is walking distance from where Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger were bayoneted to death by the M7 bayonet. That's walking distance to where Walt Disney lived in a 35,000 square foot home with an Olympic-sized swimming pool and I believe 2 tennis courts and a railroad. He had his own railroad. The engine was named after his older brother, Roy, who really created and ran Disney. Disney Studios was run by his 9-year older brother, Roy, who lived another 10 years or so. And don't be confused, Roy's son became CEO of Disney. So there's 2 Roys in the story. I'm talking about Roy Sr., who would have been involved with the Disney from inception when his uncle, Robert Disney, who we don't talk about. Robert Disney had connections with clandestine services, which created the Disney Studios, which was named the Disney Brothers Studios. Then they changed the name to just Disney Studios around the time that they moved to the Lockheed Skunk Works Burbank Hollywood Airport and also the Lookout Mountain underground facility, kind of just depicted in the Dr. Evil films. Remember Dr. Evil with Austin Powers, British intelligence, and Dr. Evil had an underground lair. Well, so did the Disney Studios. They had a 100,000 square foot, 5 studios, 100,000 square feet at 8935 Wonderland Avenue. You can Google map that. You won't see much. It's underground, right? It's like bioweapons labs. They're underground, so you can't see them. And so just look like a residential neighborhood with no sidewalks. Keyword, no sidewalks. No sidewalks. That's to keep the tourists away. There's nothing to see here. Just keep moving, people. All right, so August 9th, 1969. This is 2 years after Timothy Leary uttered the words "tune in, turn on, drop out" over by St. Ignatius High School at Sharon Meadow. Okay, that's 1967, Summer of Love, Summer of Love. And that's when Bill Graham gets his own auditorium at the corner of Geary Boulevard, next to the Scottish Rites Temple and Jim Jones's People's Temple. Next door is Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium for concerts that he's promoting on behalf of Laurel Canyon artists for Warner Brothers and Columbia Records, CBS, Masonic, Evil Eye, recording stars with provisional free housing in Haight Ashbury, because Janis Joplin had a home in Haight Ashbury. The Jefferson Starship did, or Jefferson Airplane, the Great Society before the Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, George Harrison, his musical pals. I could go on and on, but basically, if you heard their song on the radio, they had some kind of a free housing set up in Laurel Canyon and in Haight Ashbury, and perhaps in Greenwich Village, New York, also. In other words, some enclave where the CIA can control their social engineering tools, because they're vassals. They're vassals. That's what Nancy Pelosi is. She's a vassal. That's what Diane Feinstein is. She's a vassal. That's what her husband was, a vassal. So Paul Pelosi is a vassal. Okay? In other words, it's a way for operations to be conducted, through these people who have children, which compromises them. As we've learned in my videos, either the children get whacked, or the parents do, or the grandparents do, or somebody within the chain. Art Linklater being my best example I could possibly give. He had 3 children murdered, one of them being his son-in-law, age 33, John Zwire. My point is that usually you get a message. Art Linklater lived until age 97, so he got the message reluctantly, and he had a 45-year career with CBS and NBC television. So he was very successful, but he did lose 3 members of his family to murder, to suspicious murder. And so Angela Lansbury had children. She lived until age 96. So it's possible. Enos Mejia lived to 100, and she lost her daughter, Abigail. So a couple of dates here I want you to focus in on. Timothy Leary was in San Francisco from beginning in 1965. He'd been at Harvard University, been at University of California, Berkeley, got his PhD, went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, became a department head of psilocybin in 1958, 59, and was set up shop right when Abigail Folger rolls in to go to Radcliffe. Timothy Leary is there, along with a Stanford professor who left, has a PhD from Berkeley, became a professor at Stanford, then transferred to Harvard, and then was joined with Timothy Leary in Cambridge in the late 1950s. Then they had been working with hallucinogenic drugs, including LSD, which was legal, and mushroom-based hallucinogenic products off campus so that Harvard University couldn't be implicated. But they were implicated because, of course, mistakes get made. When you're experimenting with people, mistakes do get made. And mistakes were made in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And most of the mistakes, I think, were swept under the carpet, which they have a very large carpet at Harvard University. They have a very large carpet over at Stanford University, too, with endowment funds. I believe Stanford University has like 11,000 endowment funds, which is, I think, more than they have students enrolled there, undergraduate students. So you have a university that has more bank accounts than it has students. That's kind of a perversion, when you say. I mean, what kind of an organization are you running at Harvard when you have more money than you have children? Why are you charging tuition? If Harvard University never charged tuition for the next 700 years, they could easily conduct operations and pay all their ridiculous professors their normal salaries. It's because they're not running a university of education at Harvard. It's an indoctrination center and a money laundering facility. I mean, they're in the money business. They're a bank. They're a a bank by another name. They're a non-profit, endowment-based money laundering apparatus. So I'm trying to tell you, you don't have to have a burlesque club or a bowling alley or a cinema theater to run a money laundering operation. You can have a prestigious university with endowments. You can have the opera or the symphony can be a money laundering facility. I learned that when I was 21 years old. I didn't know that you could set up an endowment for an organ for the opera and collect money from a wide variety of CIA operatives, donated money to the organ fund for the Louise M. Davies Symphony Hall. That's symphony. Louise M. Davies. She was part of a money laundering apparatus. She knew, Patricia Hearst's grandfather, William Randolph Hearst. Remember the Maine. Remember the Maine. 1897. Sunk in the port of Havana, Cuba, to kick off the Spanish-American War, which the Marines set up a big operation called Guantanamo Bay. And later we had the fake Cuban Missile Crisis, flying the U-2 spy plane over. Why? You got the United States Navy and Marines are already invaded Cuba. They've been there for 60 years before we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States Navy has been in Cuba since 1897 when they sunk the Maine, allegedly. The United States Navy has had a base in Cuba for 62 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So why don't you send some Marines over to take pictures of the missile installations? You don't need a spy plane. Just walk on over. Just walk over. It's right there. It's a small island. Anyway, so we get out to August 9th, 1969. And Abigail Folger is murdered and Sharon Tate is murdered. Sharon Tate's father is working in close proximity to the Pelosi family. It's living in Presidio Heights, which is fairly close to St. Ignatius High School, St. Ignatius Church, the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. That's even closer to Presidio Heights. This is where the Zodiac killing occurs on October 11th, 1969, and Diane Feinstein is there, and Nancy Pelosi is there, and Paul Pelosi Sr. is there, and Paul Pelosi Jr. is there, and Paul James Tate, Sharon's father, is there. Michael Aquino may or may not have been there. Don't have confirmation of that. And Timothy Leary may be there. He's also, jumping on a plane to go see Yoko Ono and John Lennon in Montreal, Canada at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel. Because remember when Yoko Ono and John Lennon were married in March 16th, 1969, 4 days after Paul McCartney married Linda Epstein. Linda Epstein, she's Jewish. Her father was power of attorney for Paul McCartney. That's Leopold Epstein. Leopold Epstein, 30 years older than Paul McCartney, had a power of attorney over Paul McCartney and had his son John Epstein, which they went by Eastman. They changed their name to Eastman, kind of like Mark Lane, whose name is Levin, changed his name to Lane. And Linda Epstein changed her name to Eastman, and her older brother John Eastman. So they're handling power of attorney over Paul McCartney when Paul McCartney marries their sister-daughter on March 12th, 1969. And then Timothy Leary, who's in San Francisco, he jumps on a plane to go visit John Lennon and Yoko Ono, I believe, on May 28th, 1969, for the bet-in. So you see, that's a CIA operation. Timothy Leary is a CIA social engineering LSD maven. He's working in San Francisco. He's talking about Tune In, Turn On, Drop Out, 1967, which is right across the street from where Paul Pelosi went to high school at St. Ignatius. He is traveling to visit with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, so clearly that's a CIA operation. Yoko Ono comes from Illuminati nobility status in Tokyo, Japan. Her father is an elite private banker, of course, right? So Yoko Ono, on her third marriage, it's her fourth. It's her fourth marriage to the third person that she's married, John Lennon. John Lennon was number 3. He was number 4 in terms of paperwork. she had to go through an annulment. She's got an older daughter that we don't talk about, who she hadn't seen for 23 years while she's marrying John Lennon. She has a daughter that she hasn't seen for 10 years. Anyway, what I'm telling you is that's a CIA operation. The Bed In for Peace, that's a honeypot operation. John Lennon is murdered at the Dakota in December 8th, I believe, 1980, right? That's a CIA complex. That's where Rosemary's Baby was filmed in 1968, 1967, 68. They filmed the devil impregnating a 21-year-old Mia Farrow, who's married to a cuckold named John Cassavetes, who's the best friend of Peter Falk from Colombo. They both attended the Actors Studio in New York. It's kind of similar to the Royal Acting Academy. Royal Academy for Dramatic Acting, RADA, is to London what the Actors Studio is to New York. And Peter Falk went there, and John Cassavetes went there, and John Houseman, a Romanian Jew, was involved with that. And I think Paul Newman went there. Paul Newman's wife went there. You know, just go down the list. Pretty much most of the people in Hollywood went to the Actors Studio of New York. Most of the people that you've seen in film went to RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Acting, you know, and that's where Brian Epstein went. Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, the first manager for the Beatles, was didn't graduate, but attended the RADA program, along with Peter O'Toole, Peter Finney, Susan York, and Burt Reynolds' first wife, the Socket Toomey lady. What was her name? Judy Carn. She went there. And then Burt Reynolds' co-star, whose manager was brutally beaten to death and then drugged, Sarah Mills. Sarah Mills, she went there, right? All pretty much at the same time, too, by the way. Brian Epstein, Judy Carn, Peter O'Toole, Peter Finney, Susan York, they were all attending the London Royal Academy for Dramatic Acting, 1954, 1955. That's important. And in San Francisco, it's important to note that Abigail Folger was brutally murdered in Beverly Hills and Benedict Canyon at a home that's on Cielo Drive, but it's actually on Bella Drive. They've renamed it Cielo. They even got me convinced that it's Cielo. It's Bella Drive. And they didn't live there. Sharon Tate's clothes were not hanging in the closet. Abigail Folger's clothes were in her suitcase, which she's going to get on a plane to fly to San Francisco to tell her mother she's quitting. Her mother lives on Broadway in Pacific Heights. On Saturday, August 9th, 1969, and Paul Pelosi and Nancy are living close by. They're about a mile away in the Presidio Heights. Diane Feinstein, I believe, is living somewhere in Pacific Heights, maybe on Broadway. Enos Mejia is living on Broadway, where the infamous hammer attack occurred, near there. And Abigail Folger's coming home, except she gets bayoneted while she's fleeing the property by the M7 bayonet. So that sent a message to everybody in San Francisco. Then, okay, hit the pause button, and you go out a couple years, 3 years, and you got Harvey Milk coming to town in 1972, and he sets up a camera store south of Market on Castro Street, which I'm just here to tell you, if you just waltz into San Francisco from New York and you don't know anyone, you're not going to be able to afford to pay rent. Opening up a camera store, rent's going to be really expensive in San Francisco compared to the rents for residential homes. Anyway, it is rumored that Harvey Milk, you know, bounced around to different places to sleep. And I believe he's working for CIA in the same way that I believe Bill Graham was working for CIA when he came to San Francisco in 1965 and had a deal with Enos Mejia about where to stay, where to live, how to buy groceries. Well, they had someone that Harvey Milk had to talk to, private banker. I'm wondering if it was Paul Pelosi, because you know that when Abigail Folger was murdered, her mother, Enos Mejia, that must have affected her to where she couldn't do her job anymore. She's 62 years old, and now she's lost her daughter, and she's got to bury her over at the Colma Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery. So I'm thinking she's not really worth much as a banker during the month of August, September, October. She's in mourning. And I'm wondering if Paul Pelosi took over her duties, because he was there and ready to step in. He's 29 years old. And then they murder a yellow cab driver in Paul Pelosi's neighborhood. I wonder if that was a message to Paul Pelosi, or if it was another message to Paul Haight, who's living there also. He's living nearby. They just whacked his daughter. So he's a CIA family. Doris Haight is CIA. Doris Haight, don't fall for her crocodile tears. She knows that Charles Watson didn't kill her daughter. She knows that. She knows a military soldiers, plural, killed her daughter. But she has to play along that it was Charlie Manson, whose name is Scott. All right. Anyway, fast forward, and we go 2 more years to 1974. We have a San Francisco mayor election. And it is rumored, and there's a lot of evidence to support that there was an election fraud in that mayoral election in 1974, where George Moscone defeated Diane Feinstein and a more prominent competitor who finished second. Diane Feinstein finished third in the race for mayor, but it came down to 5,000 votes. They had to do a runoff. They had to do a runoff election because it was too close to call. And in the runoff election, George Moscone was victorious to become, I don't know, the 42nd mayor, or whatever, the 43rd mayor of San Francisco. I'm not sure where he ended up. He's in the top 40. And he's following Joseph Alioto, right? Joseph Alioto was the mayor of San Francisco during the Sharon Tate murders, during the Haight-Ashbury project, the Amphetamines research project, Operation Midnight Climax, Operation Overspray, which may or may not have been going on in the 60s. I don't know. The CIA never tells you when they're doing their stuff. And then we had this race to replace Joseph Alioto. And this was in a runoff, and it was asserted that Jim Jones and People's Temple members from Ukiah, from Mendocino County, were put on buses and sent to San Francisco to vote for George Moscone. Anyway, nothing ever came of it. George Moscone was the mayor for 4 years. And then on November, you remember that Jim Jones People's Temple then relocated to French Guiana, to Union Carbide, to a base 100 kilometers up a river from Georgetown. The capital of Guyana is Keon, but where the United States CIA embassy is in Georgetown on the Caribbean, and there's a river, and up 100 clicks, about 62 miles up the river was where they got access to Union Carbide property and built a fortress called Jonestown. I don't believe it was the only fortress. I believe they had, at least 3 other such colonies. I don't know if they were all operational because we don't talk about it. But the point is, Jonestown was one of I think, 4 CIA experimental cases. They all had pharmacies. They all had paramilitary guards. There were at least 170 armed guards with M16 rifles and ammo at Jonestown. There was a pharmacy stocked to the gills with all manner of drugs. And apparently they had Flavor Aid also. They didn't have Kool-Aid. That's a CIA mendacity. Flavor Aid out of Michigan, I believe. All right, so Jim Jones packs his bags and gets repositioned with money from the CIA, I guess, and goes to French Guiana to become a cult leader preacher, right? But he's the one who helped get George Moscone elected. All right, so we got that. Then on November 27th, 1978, 4 years into office, George Moscone is shot to death by Dan White, allegedly. I mean, it's possible he could have been shot by a professional CIA killer, and then they just blamed Dan White, which I'm kind of thinking is what happened. I think that George Moscone was assassinated by a professional killer, and then they blame it on Dan White. That's like they did with Sharon Tate. All right, Harvey Milk is also murdered at City Hall, where Nancy Pelosi just presided over the Gordon Getty family wedding, right? During lockdown in November, the month of November 2021. When we had Jonestown, when we had the assassination of George Moscone in that building, and this is where the Gordon Getty family, with no masks, wants to celebrate a wedding. You see cult ritual problems with this, people? You're going to have a wedding at a crime scene. You're having a wedding where Diane Feinstein becomes mayor of San Francisco because they murdered the mayor in a CIA hit. Then Diane Feinstein becomes mayor effectively on November 27th, 1978. Now, this is around the time that Jim Jones gets shot in the back of the head also. Now, the Jonestown mass murder allegedly occurred on the 18th of November, okay? Jonestown officially is considered November 18th, 1978, because Congressman Leo Ryan was down there with Jackie Spear. Remember her, Jackie Spear? She would know about the CIA. She's part of the CIA. Whether she believes it or not, she's completely and utterly... If you're a member of the United States Congress, you are CIA controlled 24/7. And so is Leo Ryan. So there's no way Leo Ryan's going to get murdered at the airport at Jonestown unless the CIA authorizes that hit. And there is no way that George Moscone is going to get murdered in his office at City Hall where Nancy Pelosi conducts wedding ceremonies. That's never going to happen unless the CIA authorizes a hit. There's no way that Paul Castellano is going to get murdered outside of the stakes of the Sparks Steakhouse in East Manhattan unless the CIA approves the murder of a Colombo member family, Paul Castellano. It has to be approved. It's not it's not just some guy doing it. It has to be authorized. It's not John Gotti acting on his own. John Gotti follows orders. Didn't we learn that? Didn't we learn that in all my videos that Jack Nicholson said we follow orders or people die? But we don't specify what people die. Could be your children, could be you, could be your parents. We just know people die when we don't follow orders. And that's how it works with George Moscone's assassination and Harvey Milk. So something must have been going on with Harvey Milk, who's CIA, and George Moscone, who's CIA. And he's a CIA mayor of a CIA city. And he gets murdered, assassinated. So perhaps he's not following his orders. Perhaps Harvey Milk had a change of heart and he's not following orders either. But there's Diane Feinstein and she takes over. Who takes over from George Moscone? Diane Feinstein does. Isn't that amazing? Symbolically, because again, Diane Feinstein's not managing the city of San Francisco. She's not managing Congress. She's not managing the United States Senate. Are you kidding me? She's a senator. She's not in charge of the Senate. We don't have a democracy. We don't have a House of Representatives, and we don't have a House of the Senate. We have fake leaders. And Diane Feinstein is a fake leader. Nancy Pelosi is a fake leader. The mayor of San Francisco office is a fake leader. The mayor of New York is a fake leader. These are fake, phony posers, people. The dates are important because Jim Jones didn't get killed on the same day that most of the people, the 906 people that died at Jonestown. It's in debate. It's confusing because this is on the 18th of November, but it's possible that Jim Jones lived another week, which means that he was CIA assassinated in the back of his head while he was in a rocking chair, perhaps around the 25th or 26th of November. And he's in a different time zone than George Moscone. What I'm trying to say, people, is that George Moscone, Harvey Milk, and Jim Jones, who all know each other, they all know each other. Jim Jones knows Diane Feinstein. Jim Jones knows Nancy Pelosi. Jim Jones knows Enos Mejia. Jim Jones knows George Moscone. Jim Jones knows Harvey Milk. And Harvey Milk and George Moscone and Jim Jones get assassinated, I think, within 48 hours or less of each other. I think that my supposition is that Jim Jones was killed the day before George Moscone was. This is very similar to the Diem brothers being assassinated by the CIA in Saigon. The Diem brothers, who are controlled by the CIA, the South Vietnamese army is CIA. And then they kill them on November 2nd. And then 20 days later, they kill John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22nd. Do you see the number of people that are assassinated in the month of November? The Diem brothers, that's 2. John Kennedy, JFK, that's 3. George Moscone, Harvey Milk, that's 5. Jim Jones, that's 6. Who am I leaving out? Well, anyway, those are 6 CIA assassinations that occurred, and 3 of them were from San Francisco CIA liaison partners: Moscone, Milk, and Jones. Those 3. And they work with Diane Feinstein, and they work with Nancy Pelosi. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I haven't even gotten into Patty Hearst, Patricia Hearst, because she's kidnapped, right? And no one knows where she is. But she's living next to Nancy Pelosi. She's living near St. Ignatius High School. She has 2 different homes in the neighborhood that Paul Pelosi went to high school. And no one can find Patricia Hearst. And she's right where the Pelosi family hangs out. So I'm calling that a poppycock fake kidnapping. It's an 18-month, 19-month kidnapping where nobody knew where Patty Hearst was. And the whole time she's living in Haight, Ashbury, near University of San Francisco and St. Ignatius High School. You know, just go there. If you don't know where Paul Pelosi is, just walk down Pacific Avenue. I'll bet you can find him. You can find him within 20 minutes. He's somewhere around there. Look for a home with 4 garages. All right. Just wanted to point that out, that I am aware that Jim Jones in Jonestown was supposedly around the 18th of November. But I'm here to tell you that Mark Lane, not his real name. Mark Lane was there, okay? He's a lawyer for Jim Jones. He's the fake JFK expert. He's phony fake. He's CIA. Wolf Gerjonka, CIA. He gets murdered at age 61. And they all have spent time in Haight-Ashbury. They all know Jim Jones. They all know this apparatus of money laundering is how they all get their bread buttered. That's how you butter their breads. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.